The knock on Elias Blackwood's door came like a gunshot in the dead of a stormy Wyoming night. But it wasn't the sound that woke him from his hard-earned sleep. It was the feeling. A deep, bone-rattling dread that told him 3 years of peace were about to come to a violent end. He rolled off his cot, his bare feet hitting the cold pine floorboards. Rain hammered his cabin roof like 1,000 tiny fists. Outside, lightning tore the sky in half, and for a single, stark second, his one-room world was thrown into black and white relief. Then, another round of pounding, frantic, desperate. This wasn't some lost traveler. This was someone running from something terrible. Elias grabbed the cold, heavy steel of the peacemaker from his nightstand. In this part of the territory, a stranger at your door after dark meant one thing: trouble. Deadwood Gulch was a hard 20 miles south, and honest folk didn't travel these mountain passes at night, not unless they had no other choice. He pressed his ear to the wood, listening. Nothing but the storm's fury and that knocking, weaker now, as if the person's strength was fading fast. He lifted the heavy bar, his revolver held ready. The door swung inward on its leather hinges, and Elias's breath caught in his throat. A woman stood there. Or the shape of a woman. She was swaying, covered head to toe in nothing but a thick layer of mud and terror. Her long black hair was a tangled wet mess. Her dark eyes were wide with an exhaustion so profound it looked like it had hollowed out her soul. She took one step inside, and then her legs gave out. She collapsed forward. Elias caught her on pure instinct, her cold, muddy body slumping against his chest. Her heart was hammering like a trapped bird's wings. Another flash of lightning lit up the doorway, and he saw it. The long, angry scratches that covered her arms, her legs, her shoulders. Fresh wounds, as if she'd clawed her way through miles of unforgiving wilderness. Her feet were torn and bleeding, leaving crimson prints on his threshold. He glanced past her into the howling darkness, his gun still raised. He saw nothing. No horses. No men. Just the storm-lashed trees writhing like tortured spirits. Whoever she was, whatever she was running from, she had come alone. He kicked the door shut, dropped the bar back into place, and carried her the few feet to his bed. The mud was already starting to dry on her skin, and as he gently laid her down, the flickering light from his fireplace embers caught something strange on her cheekbones. It wasn't just mud. Beneath the grime, there were patterns, faint, geometric designs. War paint. He set his revolver aside and pulled a thick wool blanket over her shivering form. Her eyes fluttered open, locking onto his with a startling intensity. She tried to speak, but only a dry, hoarse whisper came out. Her lips were cracked, her face gaunt. How long had she been out there? He grabbed a tin cup, filled it from his water pitcher, and knelt beside the bed. She took it with trembling hands and drank like a woman who hadn't seen water in days. When it was empty, she looked up at him, a flicker of desperate gratitude in her eyes. Elias threw more logs on the fire, coaxing the flames back to life. As warmth began to fill the small cabin, her ragged breathing started to even out. He'd seen his share of native women in his time on the frontier, but never one like this. Even under the mud and exhaustion, she had an air about her. High cheekbones, a strong jaw. She carried herself like someone of noble blood. The war paint suggested she was important, respected. Or she had been. He found a spare cotton shirt and held it out to her. She watched him, her eyes weighing his intentions. Then, slowly, she took it. Beneath the blanket, she pulled the shirt over her head. It hung on her slender frame, reaching almost to her knees. He turned back to the fire and started warming up what was left of his dinner, hardtack and beans. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. As he worked, he could feel her eyes on him, tracking his every move. Alert, intelligent. He handed her the plate, and she ate with a strange, restrained hunger, forcing herself to take small bites, as if her body was screaming for food, but her mind was holding it back. He studied her more closely. The scratches weren't all random. Some of them looked deliberate, almost ritualistic. Marks of grief, maybe? Or some kind of trial. He knew some of the Plains tribes practiced self-inflicted wounds during times of great spiritual turmoil. When she finished, she set the plate aside and pulled the blanket tighter. The look in her eyes had changed. It wasn't just fear or exhaustion anymore. It was a deep, soul-crushing weariness. He poured a small measure of whiskey into a cup and handed it to her. She took it without hesitation and downed it in a single, clean motion. The liquor brought a hint of color back to her cheeks and seemed to steady her nerves. The fire crackled. The storm raged outside. And in the silence of the cabin, an unspoken understanding began to form between two complete strangers. Then she spoke. Her voice was stronger now, though still raw. The words were in the Lakota tongue, a language Elias had picked up enough of to get by during his years as a trader. But her tone wasn't conversational. It was formal, ceremonial. She was thanking him. But it was more than just thanks for a roof and a meal. In her culture, what he had done, taking her in at her most vulnerable, it created a bond, a debt, one with real spiritual weight. He answered in his own broken Lakota, telling her she was safe, that she could rest. She nodded, seeming to appreciate the effort. She told him her name was Ayana, which meant eternal blossom. Then she asked for his. When he said, Elias, she repeated it softly, tasting the strange syllables. Sleep was finally claiming her. Her eyelids grew heavy. He stood up, planning to take the chair by the fire for the night, but as he walked past the bed, her hand shot out and grabbed his wrist. She shook her head, then gestured to the empty space beside her on the narrow cot. It wasn't an invitation. It was a practical offer. There was nowhere else to sleep, and the floor was cold. He hesitated. In the world he'd left behind, this would be a scandal. But they were miles from that world, and out here, survival had its own set of rules. He banked the fire, leaving just enough embers to keep the chill at bay, and lay down on the far edge of the bed. He kept a careful distance between them, but they shared the warmth of the single wool blanket. Ayana was asleep in seconds, her breathing deep and even. But Elias lay awake for hours, staring into the darkness, his mind racing. Who was she? What had happened to her? The war paint, the scratches, the frantic escape through a killer storm. It didn't add up. And the biggest question of all, the one that kept sleep at bay, was someone still out there, looking for her? Dawn broke gray and somber. The storm had passed, but a cold, heavy mist clung to the mountains like a shroud. Elias woke to find Ayana already up. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, staring out the small window. She had used the water in his wash basin to clean the mud from her skin, and now, in the pale morning light, he could see the full extent of her ordeal. The fresh scratches were angry and red, but beneath them, he saw older marks. Faint, silvery scars on her arms and shoulders that spoke of a hard life. Her face, though, is what held his gaze. Her eyes burned with a fierce intelligence. This was no helpless victim. This was a survivor. She turned and saw him watching her. For the first time, a small smile touched her lips. It transformed her. The fear and exhaustion were still there, but beneath them, he saw a beauty so striking it almost hurt to look at. She was younger than he'd thought, maybe 20, and she had the poise of a queen. She stood and walked to the window, her posture tense. She was scanning the tree line, searching for something. After a moment, her shoulders relaxed just a fraction. She hadn't found it. The storm has passed, she said. Her English was careful, precise, with the musical lilt of her own tongue. But it was good. Too good for someone from a remote tribe. I must leave soon. Leave for where? Elias sat up. You've got no horse, no supplies. The nearest town is a day's ride, and that's if the trails aren't washed out. She turned to face him, and he could see the war raging in her eyes, the need to trust him fighting against a lifetime of reasons not to. I cannot stay, she said, her voice firm. My presence here brings danger to you. It confirmed his worst fear. She wasn't just running from something. She was being hunted. Too late for that, he said, swinging his legs off the bed. The moment I opened that door, I was involved. He started slicing bacon, heating coffee over the fire. She watched him, her eyes sharp, analytical. "You speak English well," he said, breaking the silence. "Where did you learn?" A shadow crossed her face. "The mission school. At Fort Laramie. I was sent there as a child." Her voice was laced with a bitterness that was colder than the morning mist. "To be civilized. How long were you there?" 7 years, she said. "Long enough to forget who I was. Not long enough to become who they wanted me to be." She took the plate of bacon and hardtack he offered, eating with that same unnerving control. The hot coffee seemed to give her strength. When she spoke again, her voice was steady, resolved. "You have been kind to me, Elias Blackwood," she said, "but I cannot repay that kindness by bringing my war to your doorstep." "What kind of war?" he pressed. "Who's after you?" She stared into her cup for a long moment. When she finally looked up, her eyes held the weight of a terrible story. "My father is Chief Standing Bear of the Oglala Lakota," she began. "3 days ago, he promised me in marriage to a man named Iron Wolf. He is a war chief of the Crow Nation. The marriage was to be the seal on a peace treaty between our peoples." Elias felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. This was bad. Far worse than he had imagined. She wasn't just some runaway. She was a political pawn. A princess who had just sabotaged a treaty between 2 of the most powerful tribes in the territory. "Iron Wolf is not a good man," Ayanna said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "He has taken 3 wives. All of them wear the marks of his cruelty. The youngest, she died last winter. The women whisper it was not a sickness that took her. And your father knows this?" A bitter, humorless laugh escaped her lips. "My father knows that Iron Wolf brings 50 warriors to our alliance. He sees a powerful ally. He chooses not to see the monster." She stood and walked to the fire, holding her hands out to the flames. "The ceremony was to be yesterday, at dawn. The women of my tribe prepared me. They dressed me in my mother's wedding garments. They painted my face with the sacred symbols." She paused, her voice trembling slightly. "But when they came to take me to the ceremonial lodge, I was already gone." "How did you get away?" A flicker of pride lit her eyes. "My grandmother was not Lakota. She was Cheyenne, taken in a raid as a girl. She never forgot the old ways. She taught them to me in secret. While the other girls learned to sew beads, I learned to move like a shadow through the forest. To survive." She turned to face him fully. "The sentries were watching for enemies from the outside. They never thought to watch for a bride running from the inside." "But they'll be looking for you," Elias said. It wasn't a question. "Iron Wolf's trackers are the best," she confirmed, her voice grim. "The storm will have hidden my trail for a time. But they will find it. And when they do—" She didn't have to finish. Elias was no longer just a man in a cabin. He was harboring a fugitive. An act that could get him killed. An act that could spark a war. But looking at Ayanna, at the quiet fire of defiance in her eyes, he knew he'd already made his choice. "How far did you get before the storm hit?" he asked, his mind already shifting, calculating. "Maybe 15 miles. I followed the river until the rain was too heavy. Then I climbed. I was looking for shelter when I saw the light from your window. On foot, that gives us maybe half a day's lead," he calculated aloud. "On horseback, much less." The word us slipped out, and Ayanna's eyes snapped to his. "You cannot be part of this," she insisted. "I will not be the cause of your death." "Little late for that," Elias said with a wry smile. "Besides, I've got my own reasons for wanting to stay clear of other people's wars." It was the first hint he'd given her of his own past. "What did you do?" she asked, her gaze unwavering. Elias stared into the fire, and for a moment, he wasn't in his Wyoming cabin. He was back in Denver, 3 years ago. "I was a deputy U.S. Marshal," he said, his voice low. "There was a man, Garrett Mills. He ran the whole town, claimed jumping, rustling, you name it. But he was smart, connected. Nothing ever stuck. He took a swig of whiskey from the bottle on the mantel. We finally got him. Caught him red-handed selling rifles to a gang of outlaws. We had a witness, one of his own men, ready to testify. Ayanna sat on the edge of the bed, listening, sensing this story was the key to understanding him. 2 days before the trial, Elias continued, his voice hardening, our witness was found dead in an alley. The other witnesses suddenly couldn't remember a thing. The evidence, it vanished from the marshal's office. What happened to Mills? Ayanna asked softly. Charges dropped. He walked out a free man. That night, he bought the whole town a round of drinks, bragging about how he'd outsmarted the law, how he'd arranged the accident for our witness. Elias turned from the fire, his eyes dark with a cold old anger. Word got back to me. I could have tried to build another case, but I'd learned by then that justice in the territories isn't always found in a courtroom. The silence in the cabin was thick with unspoken words. I found him in his office a few nights later, Elias said, his voice flat. He went for his gun. I was faster. So you ran, Ayanna stated. I resigned my commission and disappeared. Built this cabin. Been here ever since. Do you regret it? He met her gaze. I regret that it had to happen. I don't regret that justice was done. A new understanding passed between them. They were the same in a way. Two outcasts, running from lives they could no longer live, willing to choose a harder path because the alternative was unthinkable. We both chose freedom, Ayanna whispered. Before he could answer, a sound cut through the morning mist. The faint, distant whinny of a horse. They both froze. Elias moved like lightning, grabbing his gun belt from a peg on the wall and strapping it around his waist. The familiar weight of the Colt was a cold comfort. Stay away from the window, he hissed, creeping toward the glass to peer outside. The forest was quiet, eerily quiet. But the sound had been real. Then another, the creak of saddle leather, the soft thud of hooves on damp earth. Not one horse, several. Moving slowly, deliberately, searching. Ayanna was beside him in an instant. How many? She whispered. Can't tell. At least 3, maybe more. He saw them then. Through a gap in the pines, maybe 200 yards out, 4 riders moving in single file. They wore buckskin and feathers. They sat their horses like men who were born in the saddle. Crow? He asked. Ayanna nodded, her face pale. Iron Wolf's best. The lead rider. That's Kills at Night. He can track a ghost across solid rock. As they watched, Kills at Night reined in his horse. He dismounted, kneeling to examine the ground. After a long moment, he stood and pointed, directly at the cabin. He's found my trail, Ayanna breathed. The 4 warriors urged their horses forward, spreading out. Their pace was faster now, more purposeful. Elias could see the chilling details. The harsh lines of war paint on their faces, the rifles held ready in their hands. How long do we have? Elias asked, his mind racing through impossible options. Minutes, Ayanna said, her voice tight. They'll surround the cabin first. Make sure there's no escape. Then they will demand you give me to them. And if I refuse? Her dark eyes met his, and he saw no fear, only a grim certainty. Then they will kill you. And they will take me anyway. The cold calm settled over Elias, the same focus he'd felt in every gunfight, every showdown. Time slowed down. The world sharpened. There's another option, he said quietly. What? We don't wait for them. We run. Ayanna stared at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. You would abandon your home? For me? A woman you met less than a day ago? This cabin is just wood and nails, he said, already moving, stuffing supplies into a leather saddlebag. Ammunition, dried meat, a small pouch of gold coins. And our situation is about to get complicated whether we stay or go. If we leave now, at least we're on our own terms. He slung the bag over his shoulder. My horse is in the lean-to out back. We can be over that ridge before they even know we're gone. Where would we go? She asked, but he could hear the hope in her voice, fighting against the despair. West, Utah Territory. They ask fewer questions there. We can start over. The sound of hoofbeats was closer now, just beyond the tree line. They could hear the warriors calling to each other in their own tongue. Decide, Ayanna, Elias said, his voice low and urgent. Now. In another minute, it will be too late. She took one last look around the small cabin, the place that had been her sanctuary. Then her eyes met his, and in them, he saw her answer. They moved as one. Elias grabbed his rifle from its pegs above the fireplace. Ayanna pulled on his spare pair of boots. They were far too big, but they were better than bare feet. In the lean-to, Elias's big bay gelding Thunder shifted nervously, sensing the danger. As Elias threw the saddle on, he could hear the Crow warriors closing in, their voices clearer now. "They're taking positions," Ayanna translated in a harsh whisper. "The leader says to take me alive, but to kill any white man who gets in the way." Elias swung into the saddle, then reached down and pulled Ayanna up behind him. She wrapped her arms tight around his waist. "Hold on," he grunted and spurred the horse hard. They exploded from the lean-to at a full gallop, not towards the trail, but straight up the steep, rocky slope behind the cabin. Shouts of anger and surprise erupted from the forest below. The thunder of pursuing hooves answered them almost immediately. But Elias knew this mountain. He'd spent 3 years exploring every game trail, every ravine. The steep, treacherous terrain was an advantage. They crested the ridge just as the sun burned through the mist, revealing a staggering panorama of valleys and peaks stretching to the west, but there was no time to admire the view. Below them, the Crow warriors were pushing their horses hard up the slope. "There!" Ayanna shouted over the wind, pointing to a narrow canyon cutting between 2 massive rock formations. "The old mining trails! They'll have trouble following us in there!" Elias urged Thunder down the other side, the horse sliding on loose rock as they plunged toward the canyon mouth. The walls rose up around them, swallowing the sunlight. The air grew cold. The canyon floor was a nightmare of boulders and fallen logs, forcing them to slow down. The sounds of pursuit faded behind them, but it was a temporary relief. Kills at night wouldn't give up that easily. They burst out of the canyon's far side into a wide, open valley, and Ayanna stiffened behind him. "Stop," she breathed. Elias reined Thunder to a halt, his eyes scanning the peaceful-looking grassland ahead. At first, he saw nothing. Then, they emerged from a stand of golden aspen trees. More riders, at least 6 of them. And they weren't Crow. Their war bonnets and painted ponies were unmistakable. "Lakota?" Elias asked, his heart sinking. Ayanna nodded, her voice filled with a new kind of dread. "My father's men, and the one in the lead. That is my brother. Walks with Thunder." She took a shaky breath. "He will not let me bring shame upon our family. He will drag me back himself." They were trapped. Crow warriors behind them, her own people ahead. The valley walls were too steep to climb. There was nowhere to go. Elias's mind raced, searching for any option, any advantage. There was a small grove of trees in the middle of the valley. It offered cover, but it was also a trap. "Is there any other way?" he asked, his voice tight. Ayanna scanned the valley, her eyes desperate. "There is a place," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "My grandmother. She showed it to me once. The lightning-struck pine." She pointed to a single ancient tree on a low rise, its trunk blackened and scarred. Beneath it, there are caves. They run through the mountain. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot they had. He spurred Thunder toward the lone pine. The Lakota had seen them now, and were closing in. A steady, relentless advance. From the canyon behind them, the Crow war cries echoed as they emerged into the valley. They reached the pine tree, just as both groups of pursuers began to converge. Ayanna slid off the horse, frantically pulling at rocks and brush at the base of the tree. Elias stayed in the saddle, his rifle resting on his thigh, his eyes locked on her brother. "Sister!" Walks with Thunder's voice rang across the valley. "You have dishonored our father. Surrender now, and I will ask Iron Wolf to show mercy." "I will not be that monster's wife," Ayanna yelled back, her hands tearing at the earth. "I choose my own path." "You are the daughter of a chief," her brother retorted, his face a mask of cold fury. "Your path is the one that serves our people. Your marriage ensures peace. Your selfish wishes are nothing." The Crow warriors had reached the edge of the grove, fanning out, content to watch the family drama unfold. They knew their prize was cornered. "Found it!" Ayanna cried. She'd revealed a narrow crack between two boulders, almost completely hidden. But there was a problem. Thunder couldn't fit. Leaving the horse meant they'd be stranded, with no escape once the caves were discovered. Elias made his decision in a heartbeat. He swung down from the saddle, gave Thunder a hard slap on the rump, and sent the loyal horse galloping away, a perfect decoy. "Go!" he yelled at Ayanna, shoving her toward the opening. She squeezed through and vanished into the darkness. Elias scrambled in after her, pulling a thick bush over the entrance. The darkness inside was absolute. The air was cold and damp, thick with the smell of ancient stone. They could hear the shouts from the valley as their pursuers discovered the riderless horse. The hunt was on. They stumbled forward, hands outstretched, following a narrow tunnel that sloped deeper into the mountain. The passage opened into a vast cavern. Faint light filtered down from cracks high above, revealing a breathtaking subterranean world. The walls were smooth limestone, carved by water into ghostly shapes. Ancient paintings covered the walls. Herds of buffalo, hunters with spears, strange, spiritual figures. "My grandmother brought me here as a child," Ayanna whispered, her voice echoing in the immense space. "She said these caves are sacred, a place where the spirits of the earth dwell." They could hear the muffled sound of hooves passing on the ground far above them. For now, they were safe. As their eyes adjusted, they found a small alcove and sank to the ground, exhausted. Hours passed in the dim, silent world beneath the mountain. The sounds from above faded as the search parties moved on. They shared the last of the dried meat, drank from a trickle of pure water seeping through the rock. And they talked. Not as fugitives, but as two people who had nothing left to lose. She told him of her childhood, of a fierce grandmother who taught her to be more than what her tribe expected of a woman. He told her more about Denver, about the corruption that had eaten away at his soul until he had to cut it out or be consumed by it. "When I saw you in my doorway," he admitted, his voice low in the darkness, "covered in mud, I thought I was seeing a ghost." "And when you took me in," she replied, her voice just as soft, "without asking for a reason, I knew you were not like the other white men I had known. You saw a person, not a savage." Their hands found each other in the gloom. It was more than just attraction. It was recognition. Two lonely souls who had found their other half in the middle of a war. "What happens now?" she asked, as the faint light from above began to fade into the purple of dusk. "We wait for full dark," Elias said. "Your grandmother." "Did she tell you where these caves lead?" "To the other side of the mountain," Ayanna confirmed. "A place she called the Valley of the Setting Sun." "Then that's where we go," he said. "From there west, we'll make it to Utah. We can build a new life. Together. If that's what you want." She squeezed his hand. "It's all I want. But Elias, you understand what this means. I can never go back. To my people, I will be a ghost. An outcast." "It seems we have that in common," he replied, a faint smile in his voice. "Let's be outcasts together." They moved through the labyrinth of stone in total darkness, guided only by Ayanna's memory and the faint drafts of air that hinted at a way out. It was a terrifying, claustrophobic journey. After what felt like an eternity, they saw it. A spray of stars in a patch of blackness ahead. They emerged from a narrow fissure onto a high mountain ledge. The cool night air was the sweetest thing Elias had ever tasted. Below them, miles away in the dark expanse of the valley, a few scattered lights twinkled. "Bitter Creek," Ayanna said. "A mining town, not friendly, but they don't ask questions." The descent took the rest of the night. By the time the first hint of dawn touched the eastern peaks, they were on the outskirts of the rough settlement. Using a few of his gold coins, Elias bought two tough-looking Mustangs and enough supplies to get them across the basin. The livery owner barely glanced at them. In a town like Bitter Creek, A man with a native woman was the least strange thing he'd see all day. They rode west, leaving the mountains of their nightmare behind them. For the first time in days they felt a flicker of hope. But as they crested a low rise a few miles out of town, Ayanna reined in her horse. "Riders," she said, her voice flat. Elias turned. Silhouetted against the rising sun were 5 horsemen. They were far back, but they were moving fast, following their trail with the grim persistence of wolves. Even at this distance, he could see the distinctive shape of their feathered war bonnets. "It can't be," he muttered. "How?" "Someone in town," Ayanna said, her face grim. "Someone saw us. Someone talked. It didn't matter who. It only mattered that Iron Wolf's trackers were back. And this time, they were in open country. There were no more caves to hide in. No more forests to lose them in. Just miles and miles of unforgiving desert. The chase was on again. But this time was different. This time, they weren't just running from something. They were running towards a future. A life they had chosen. Elias spurred his horse, and Ayanna was right beside him. They galloped west, towards the empty promise of the Utah Territory. 2 outcasts against the world, with nothing but each other and the will to survive. Behind them, the hunters gained ground. Ahead, the sun beat down on a landscape that offered no water, no shelter, and no mercy. The hope they had felt just moments before was already turning to dust in the desert wind. They had escaped the trap, but now they were in the fire, and they both knew this desperate race could only end one of 2 ways, in freedom or in blood. They rode for 3 days, pushing the horses and themselves to the absolute limit. They slept in short, fitful bursts, one always standing watch while the other collapsed into an exhausted slumber. The Crow warriors were relentless. Every time Elias and Ayanna thought they had lost them, they would reappear on the horizon, a persistent, deadly mirage. The desert was a crucible, burning away everything but their will to live. Water became more precious than gold. Every sip was a victory, every hidden spring a miracle. On the 4th day, they reached Cedar Falls, an outpost in eastern Utah. It was a Mormon settlement, larger and more organized than Bitter Creek. They rode in looking like ghosts, covered in dust, their faces cracked by the sun. They bought fresh horses and supplies, not daring to stay longer than an hour. In the general store, Elias overheard men talking about a wagon train heading for California, leaving at dawn. It was a chance. Safety in numbers. That night they camped with the other travelers just outside of town. A grizzled wagon master named Garrett took Elias on as a scout without asking too many questions. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, they slept without fear, surrounded by the quiet hum of 100 other people dreaming of a new life. "No regrets?" Elias asked Ayanna as they sat by the fire, watching the stars blaze in the clear desert sky. She looked at him, her eyes reflecting the flames. "Only that it took me so long to find the courage to live for myself. What about you, Elias? Do you ever miss that cabin?" He thought of the lonely silence, the long years of self-imposed exile. "I don't miss the quiet," he said, pulling her close. "I just didn't know what I was listening for." The wagon train was a slow, lumbering beast, a snake of canvas and wood crawling across the vast, empty landscape. Elias and Ayanna rode as outriders, their eyes constantly scanning the horizon. The Crow were gone. They hadn't seen them since Cedar Falls. Maybe the presence of the wagon train had scared them off. Maybe they had finally given up. A fragile sense of peace began to settle over them. They talked of the future, of a small piece of land near the ocean, of a life where they wouldn't have to look over their shoulders. 5 days out from Cedar Falls, they crested a high mesa. Ayanna suddenly pulled her horse to a stop. She pointed to the east, back the way they had come. "Smoke," she said. Elias saw it. A thin black pillar rising against the blue sky. It was miles away, but its meaning was unmistakable. It wasn't a signal fire. It was too deliberate. "They're burning something," he said. "They are wiping their trail," Ayanna corrected him, her voice grim. "So no one can follow them. They haven't given up, Elias. They are shadowing us, waiting for us to leave the wagon train. waiting for us to be alone again. The fragile peace shattered. The rest of the journey to California was a slow torture. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every distant rider was a potential enemy. They were surrounded by people, yet they had never felt more alone. The desert was no longer just a physical challenge. It was a psychological one. Iron Wolf was playing with them, letting them taste freedom before he snatched it away. 2 grueling weeks later, the landscape began to change. The red rock and sagebrush gave way to rolling hills and oak trees. They had reached California. They rode into Sacramento, a booming, chaotic city overflowing with gold prospectors, merchants, and fortune seekers from every corner of the globe. It was noisy, dirty, and dangerous, and it was the perfect place to disappear. They parted ways with the wagon train, collected their pay from Garrett, and found a room in a boarding house run by a kind-faced widow. For the first time, they were truly anonymous. Just 2 more faces in a crowd of thousands, all hoping to strike it rich. Elias, using his past experience, easily found work as a deputy sheriff. The pay was good, and the law in Sacramento was desperate for men who knew how to handle a gun. Ayanna, with her mission school education, became a teacher at a small school for the children of immigrants. Life settled into a routine. The constant fear began to fade, replaced by the simple rhythms of work and home. They were building a life, piece by piece. 6 months after arriving, they were married by a traveling preacher. Their friends from the boarding house stood as witnesses. It was a simple ceremony, but for them, it was the culmination of an impossible journey. They were no longer running. They were home. But the past has a long shadow. One evening, a year after they arrived in Sacramento, Elias was finishing his rounds. The city was settling down for the night, the saloons still loud, but the streets quieter. As he passed an alley, he heard voices. One of them was speaking Lakota. He froze. It couldn't be. He drew his revolver and peered into the darkness. 2 men stood over a third, who was slumped against a wall, bleeding. One of the standing men turned, and Elias's blood ran cold. It was Walks with Thunder, Ayanna's brother. The other man was a Crow warrior he didn't recognize, but his face was grim and hard. "He was supposed to tell us where she was," Walks with Thunder said in his own language, kicking the man on the ground. "This city is a maze." They had found them. After all this time, they had found them. Elias stepped out of the shadows, his gun leveled. "Looking for someone?" he asked, his voice steady. Walks with Thunder spun around, his hand flying to the knife at his belt. His eyes widened in shock when he saw Elias. "You!" he snarled. "The white man who stole my sister." "She wasn't stolen," Elias said calmly. "She chose. There's a difference." The Crow warrior lunged, but Elias was ready. He fired a single shot, not to kill, but to cripple. The warrior screamed and fell, clutching his leg. Walks with Thunder hesitated, his eyes darting between Elias and his fallen comrade. "It's over," Elias said. "Go home. Leave us in peace." "Peace?" Walks with Thunder laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "There is no peace. You don't understand what you have done. It was never just about a marriage. It was about guns." Elias frowned. "What are you talking about?" "The man Iron Wolf made his deal with. The man who was supplying him with rifles to wage war on the whites. On everyone. His name was Garrett Mills." The name hit Elias like a physical blow. Garrett Mills. The man he'd killed in Denver. It all crashed into place. The reason Iron Wolf was so relentless. It wasn't about a bride. It was about revenge. And it was about a gun-running operation that Elias had only clipped the edge of 3 years ago. His past and Ayanna's were not just parallel. They were the same story. He hadn't escaped his past in Denver. He had ridden right into the heart of it. "Iron Wolf is here," Walks with Thunder said, a look of grim satisfaction on his face. "He came for his bride, and for the man who killed his partner." Suddenly, the alley was filled with shadows. More Crow warriors, materializing from the darkness. Elias was trapped. He fired again, but he was outnumbered. A heavy blow from behind sent him to his knees. His gun was kicked from his hand. Through a haze of pain, he saw a new figure step into the alley. He was tall and broad, his face a landscape of old scars. His eyes burned with a cold, hateful fire. Iron Wolf. "So," the war chief said in guttural English, looking down at Elias. "The ghost of Denver. I have waited a long time for this." He turned to his men. "Take him, and find my wife. It is time to end this." They dragged Elias away, leaving Walks with Thunder standing alone in the alley. The Lakota warrior looked down at the Crow warrior Elias had shot, then back in the direction they had taken Elias. For the first time since Elias had met him, he saw something other than anger in the man's eyes. He saw doubt. When Elias didn't come home, Ayanna knew. A cold dread, the same feeling she'd had in her father's camp the night she fled, settled over her. She barred the door to their small house and loaded the rifle Elias had taught her how to use. She would not be taken. Not again. But the knock on the door, when it came, was not the brutal smashing she expected. It was soft, tentative. "Ayanna," a voice called. "Sister, it is me." It was her brother. She opened the door a crack, the rifle still leveled. Walks with Thunder stood there, alone. His face was a mess of conflicting emotions. "They have him," he said, his voice strained. "Iron Wolf has him. He plans to kill him at sunrise, as a message." "Why are you telling me this?" Ayanna asked, her voice like ice. "This is what you wanted." "I wanted to restore my family's honor," he said, looking at the ground. "I followed my father's command. But I have seen Iron Wolf's cruelty. I heard him talk tonight. He does not want peace. He wants war. He used our father. He used me. He used you. The guns from Mills. They were to be his army. He means to carve out an empire, and he will kill anyone, Lakota or white, who stands in his way." He finally looked up, and his eyes pleaded with her. "He is not our way, sister. I was wrong." A plan formed, desperate and dangerous. Walks with Thunder knew where they were holding Elias, an old, abandoned warehouse down by the river. The Sacramento sheriff was a good man, but his handful of deputies would be no match for Iron Wolf's warriors in a straight fight. They had to be smarter. Ayanna and her brother went to the one place in the city that had more armed, angry men than anywhere else. The miners' camp. They were a rough, lawless bunch, but they hated one thing more than any other: anyone threatening their claims and their city. Ayanna, speaking with a passion and authority that surprised even her brother, told them the story. She didn't paint it as a personal matter. She told them of a war chief bent on driving every last one of them out of California, of a hidden cache of rifles meant to arm a new army. She told them Iron Wolf was the source of the raids on supply lines that had been plaguing them for months. She told them a lie that was built on a truth, and it worked. Greed and fear are powerful motivators. By the time the sun began to rise, Ayanna and her brother were leading a small army of 50 grizzled, heavily armed miners toward the waterfront. Elias was tied to a post in the center of the warehouse. Iron Wolf stood before him, savoring his victory. "Your woman will be here soon," the chief sneered. "She will watch you die. Then she will learn what it means to be my wife." "She'll never be your wife," Elias grunted through a split lip. Just then, the warehouse doors exploded inwards. The miners, led by the sheriff and his deputies, poured in, guns blazing. The Crow warriors, caught completely by surprise, were thrown into chaos. In the confusion, Walks with Thunder cut Elias loose, handing him a revolver. The warehouse became a maelstrom of smoke and gunfire. Elias and Iron Wolf finally came face to face in the middle of it all. It wasn't a duel of honor. It was a brutal, desperate fight for survival. They crashed through crates and barrels, their knives flashing in the dim light. It ended with Elias's back against a wall, Iron Wolf's massive hands around his throat, squeezing the life out of him. Then a shot rang out, louder than the rest. Iron Wolf's eyes went wide. He staggered back, a dark stain spreading across his chest. He looked down in disbelief, then collapsed. Ayanna stood in the doorway, the smoking rifle in her hands. Her face was calm, her aim true. It was over. The surviving Crow warriors surrendered. The gun-running plot was exposed, and Elias, far from being a wanted man, was hailed as a hero who had uncovered a threat to the entire territory. Walks with Thunder, in a quiet act of reconciliation, pledged his loyalty not to a war chief, but to the cause of a real, lasting peace. He and his sister said their goodbyes, two family members who had found their way back to each other through a river of violence and misunderstanding. He rode east, a changed man, to tell their father the truth. Elias and Ayanna walked home through the streets of Sacramento as the sun rose, washing the city in gold. Their long chase was finally, truly over. They had faced down their pasts, fought for their future, and won. They had built a life not on the ashes of what they had run from, but on the foundation of what they had fought for. Their story became a quiet legend in the burgeoning city, a tale of two outcasts from different worlds who found each other in a storm and refused to be torn apart by the wars of men. They proved that home isn't a place you find, but something you build, and that the strongest love is the kind that's tested by fire. If you enjoyed this story of survival, justice, and the fight for love against all odds, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what's coming next.